guys, Samuel Allred here. Welcome back to the Persistence Outdoors podcast. While there aren't many hunting seasons open right now, many of us are already looking forward to late summer and fall hunts, getting excited and starting to prepare. Today, I want to talk about something that I think is important to consider even when you're months out from your season. And that is finding reliable footwear, specifically hunting boots. For the sake of this podcast, we're talking about leather or synthetic, lace-up, sort of traditional style hunting boots. Of course, you can hunt in rubber boots or pack boots or whatever, but that's not what we're going to focus on today. Now, maybe you haven't considered your footwear for the fall season quite yet, but if you need a pair of boots, you should start thinking about it now. And you should start thinking about it now for two reasons. First of all, boots can be really expensive. So if you want to find a deal, it's not a bad idea to figure out what you're looking for and then be ready to buy when you see the boots you want on sale, secondhand, or just for a reasonable price. And then secondly, you'll likely need some time to break in your boots before the hunting season. There's no set distance. It could be 20 miles, it could be 50 miles, but you'll want to get familiar with your boots, let them loosen up a little, figure out how to lace them, figure out what socks to use, all of that before you head out on your hunt. If it's a day hunt, maybe it's not a huge deal, but for a longer hunt, maybe a week-long hunt, it would be a mistake to head out with boots that you haven't worn. So thinking about it now gives you some time to try on some boots, see what you like, look for a sale, and then break them in before you hit the field. Today, I'm going to talk about all the different qualities of a hunting boot so you can know what you're looking for and choose a pair for yourself. I'll also tell you about my recent experiences with hunting boots and how what I prioritize and wear might change in the future. Before we get into it, I want to say thank you to everybody who listens to and supports this podcast. I'm always motivated by thinking about what could be helpful for you guys. And as many of you know, I am by no means an expert or professional hunter. I'd call myself an enthusiast. But if anything I've learned or explained has helped you out, I call that a success. So thanks for listening. Thanks for motivating me. And if you have any questions that I can help out with, either from my own experience or through research, shoot me a message on Facebook or Instagram. You can find the Persistence Outdoors page on either of those platforms. And I'll do my best to answer your questions directly and maybe even make a podcast about it. So with that, let's get into it. The first thing I want to say is that every foot is different. What's going to work for one person might not work for another. So I'm going to do my best not to tell you which boot to buy, but rather explain all the different characteristics so you can make your own informed decision. And then at the end, I'll tell you my experience with boots right now and give you my own sort of biased, unfiltered opinions. And you can do with those what you will. But for now, let's start by talking about flex. The flex in your boot is referring to the sole and how much the boot bends if you were to take the boot and hold the heel of it and the toe of it and push together, how much it bends in between. Some boots are going to be more flexible than others, and others are going to be much less flexible. And there's different advantages to flexible or non-flexible boots. So some boot manufacturers out there like Crispi, CRISPI, use a flexibility scale of 1 to 5. And 1 is very flexible. It's like a running shoe, maybe even a flip-flop, very, very flexible. And 5 is not flexible at all. It's like completely rigid. And if you tried to bend the boot, it's just not going to bend. It might bend a little bit under a heavy load, like under a person with a pack stepping on it. But generally speaking, it's not going to bend. And then in between, you have 2, 3, and 4, which are probably the most common flex ratings for hunting boots. So the advantages of a flexible boot are that they are very comfortable. They aren't going to inhibit your natural movement very much. When your foot bends, the boot is going to bend, and you will likely have a lot of ground feel under the boot. You'll be able to feel and get feedback from the ground, feel what you're stepping on, and that can actually be helpful so that you can then naturally balance. And it's something that you probably do subconsciously. But sometimes having that ground feel can actually be a positive experience when you're wearing a boot. Now, a more rigid boot, let's say a 5, is used to give you stability in steep country. And there are certain things that when you're in very, very steep country, you may want that rigid boot for. So let's say you are on a very steep face of snow. Having that rigid boot allows you to kick in toe holds. Or if you're on a very steep hill, you can use the edge of your rigid boot to side hill. And you can kick that edge into the hill, and then it catches and gives you basically a solid platform to push up on with your foot. And having that rigid boot can actually help your calves work less and almost give you a feeling of taking stairs up a hill instead of the way it would feel with a flexible boot, where you would put your foot on the hill, it would flex maybe at the ball of your foot, maybe your heel would go all the way down to the hill and your calf would be stretched. And it's a lot of work on the calves. With a more rigid boot, even on those steep hills, the idea is that you can have a stable platform every time you plant your foot. So what's the downside of a rigid boot? Well, a rigid boot is likely going to be less comfortable on flat ground, because if you think about walking naturally, your foot bends every time you walk. But if you strap it into a rigid boot, you are not going to be able to bend the sole of that boot when you walk. And that can be very uncomfortable on flat ground, and it can create an unnatural gait and an uncomfortable experience when you're just trying to walk and get around. So there are advantages and disadvantages to both flexible and rigid boots. And most hunting boots are going to fall somewhere in between a 1 and a 5 on that scale. They might be a 3, meaning it has some rigidity to give you more stability even in steep country, but it's still going to flex some so that you get that natural walking motion, even when you're on flat trails and just walking around. Another characteristic you'll see in hunting boots is that they will be largely made of leather or largely made with synthetic materials. And sometimes there'll be a mix of both, but often you have a choice between the two. So leather is sort of your classic choice, and leather is a great option because it's durable, it can take a beating, and it offers some water resistance, and that water resistance can actually be bolstered with topical applications like waterproofing waxes or creams. And if you take care of that leather and keep it clean and conditioned, it can last you for a very, very long time. Now, some of the problems with leather are that it's not as breathable as synthetics. Because it is basically a piece of skin, water can't escape through that as well as it could escape through a piece of synthetic fabric. And leather boots can also be heavy, and we'll talk a little bit more about weight later. Now, synthetic boots, on the other hand, can be a good option, but they're usually not as durable as leather boots. It just depends on their construction and what materials are used, but they tend to break down a little bit faster than leather boots. They are much more breathable than leather boots, which is a great quality, especially if you're hunting in hot weather. And because they're made from synthetic fabrics, water can escape through the weave of those fabrics and keep your foot comfortable in that way. At the same time, though, those synthetic fabrics are likely not as waterproof as leather. So if you're walking around in snow and you have untreated leather versus untreated synthetic fabric, your synthetic fabric is likely going to soak through much faster than the leather. You can put on treatments for synthetic fabric that help to make it more waterproof, but anything that's breathable is going to be less waterproof by nature of having small holes in it. Finally, synthetic boots can sometimes be a little more comfortable just because of the way the fabric moves and molds around your foot. Leather often has to be broken in and it will start to wear in specific places and kind of get used to the way that your foot moves. But synthetics don't need as much break-in usually, and they can just be a little bit more comfortable. Generally speaking, people like synthetics for warm weather and for earlier season hunts, and then might transition to leather for late season hunts. If you're just looking for an all year round boot, though, you can kind of take your pick. I would just find something that is as waterproof as you need it to be and is comfortable. Speaking of waterproof boots, most good hunting boots out there are going to have some sort of waterproof lining, and the most common lining is Gore-Tex. So it will be a Gore-Tex bootie, essentially, and then there will be an insole inside of that, and then outside of the Gore-Tex bootie is going to be built the leather or synthetic boot. And that Gore-Tex bootie allows your feet to breathe to an extent. As the air heats up in your boot, it will move outside of that membrane and it keeps water from coming in. And it really is the best way to actually have a waterproof boot. You could have just a leather boot and use some sort of waterproofing cream on it, but eventually leather soaks through, synthetics will soak through, but having that Gore-Tex lining really helps to keep your feet comfortable and dry on a hunt. So for me, it's pretty much mandatory. There are other types of waterproof linings out there. I think Schnee's uses something called Sympatex, and it's very similar. So just check to make sure that your boot has that sort of lining. And besides going to a rubber boot or something, that's your best bet for keeping your feet dry on a hunt. Let's talk about the height of a hunting boot. Why would you want a short or tall hunting boot? So on the short end, having a short boot allows for more breathability. It is going to be lighter weight, and it may be more comfortable because it's not going up as far on your shin. Now, a tall boot, on the other hand, is going to protect your lower leg more. You might even think of upland bird hunting boots that go up 12 inches or more, and they're going to protect your lower leg from thorns, from rocks, from logs. They will be useful for walking through water, or even just deep mud or wet grass. But that extra height is also going to add a lot of weight. The height of a boot can also have an effect on ankle support, but I don't think it's as much as people think it is. Really, as long as the boot is going over your ankle, it's a lot more about the construction and the stiffness of the boot rather than the height. I don't think a 10-inch boot is going to give you more ankle support than a 6 or 8-inch boot that goes over your ankle. So really, you're talking about protecting the lower leg, keeping water out and keeping debris out, and also possibly some warmth advantages. So let's think about this for a moment in the context of what you might encounter on a hunt. Let's say you are on a early September archery elk hunting season, and there's no snow anywhere. In fact, it's pretty warm and dry. Well, you might want something a little bit shorter because you're not dealing with as much wetness. It will help your foot breathe a little bit more, and it will be lighter weight, which is just a great advantage when you're trying to cover lots of miles searching for elk. Now, let's say you're hunting later in the season and you're going to be hunting for deer and it's already snowed on the ground. Well, at that point, you might want something taller just so that snow doesn't get in over the top of your boot and get your feet wet and make you cold. If you're looking for a good all-around range, 8 inches is a good way to go. It gives you just enough height to be able to walk through some shallow streams without having to take off your boots and wear sandals or something. And it's not so tall that it's adding tons and tons of weight. You could even go down to 6 inches. You'll see a lot of popular backpacking and hiking boots at about 6 inches tall. And if you needed extra water protection, you could throw on some gaiters, which I've talked about in the past, actually. If you want to learn more about gaiters, go check out episode 15, Gaiters for Hunting. So that's about it on height. Find something that's comfortable for you. Some guys do find that taller boots are uncomfortable because they constrict their calf even, and so they want something shorter. Other people find that they like taller boots because it allows them to go more places conveniently. I think it's a personal preference thing and just depending on the terrain and the time of year that you're hunting. What about the outsole of your boot? Now, this kind of ties in with stiffness because it will affect the stiffness of the boot, but there's some characteristics of the outsole that you want to look for as well. So, first of all is traction. You want to have some good traction on a hunting boot for going over rocks and any sort of terrain you encounter. Sort of the gold standard is a Vibram outsole. If you see the boot has a Vibram outsole, you're probably in good hands. But you can also just do a visual inspection and say, hey, does this have lugs? Is it a durable rubber? And look for reviews about the boot that have to do with the traction that you get. Another thing you might notice with the sole of the boot is the ground feel, and different boots are going to give you more or less ground feel. And again, some people like very little ground feel. They just want to feel their boot and have a consistent step every time. Other people want more of that ground feel because it's useful information when you're trying to move over broken terrain. Now, I actually think this is very interesting because think about a boot that doesn't have very much ground feel and say it's pretty stiff, it doesn't bend very much. Think about putting that boot on a log. And so you step on a log, and the idea of a stiffer boot with less ground feel is that you have a consistent, stable foot placement every time. But if you put a stiff boot with a big, stiff outsole on a log, you're only going to have one very small point of contact. And the rest of that boot is going to be flat. It's just, it's like a tangent, like a geometrical tangent where your flat line, the bottom of the boot, is intersecting with the circle of the log at only one point, right? So you don't actually have many points of contact when you're using a stiffer boot on some of these surfaces. Whereas if you had a more flexible boot with more ground feel, your boot is going to shape to the log or shape to the surface that you're on a little bit more and potentially give you more points of contact. So I think that's one thing that's kind of misunderstood is that you could have a very stiff boot with this big chunky outsole that has all these lugs, but on certain types of terrain, it might not actually be as beneficial as having something that's a little bit more flexible and gives you some more ground feel. The last thing I would consider when looking at a sole or researching a boot is whether you can re-sole it or not. Quality hunting boots can often be resoled. So if you're spending a lot of money on a hunting boot, getting your hunting boot resoled instead of just buying a new pair can be a good way to save a little bit of money and extend the life of your boot. Another feature you'll find in boots is insulation. You'll often see uninsulated or different amounts of insulation, usually listed in grams. So you'll have 200 grams of insulation, 400 grams of insulation, whatever. Insulation will help keep your feet warm, but on the flip side, if you're trying to use an insulated boot in any time when it's not cold, it can be very uncomfortable, leading to excess sweat and wet feet. When choosing an all-around boot, I would recommend to get an uninsulated boot, because with an uninsulated boot, you can use it even in warm weather, and then if it gets cold, you can add a thicker pair of socks and keep your feet warm that way. If you need insulation though, you'll probably know it. Maybe you live in a frigid area, or you hunt the late season, or your feet get cold easily, or even you are a stand hunter and you're staying still for a long time. Those are all times when it might be a good idea to get some insulation in your boots. So choose whatever seems right for you, and I always like to use the 80-20 rule. Choose something that will work for 80% of your hunts, and you'll likely be very happy with it. Just a side note, one thing you should consider if you're trying to keep your feet warm is the circulation, the blood flow. Oftentimes, if you go and tighten your boot too much and just cinch your laces down, it can cut off the circulation to your feet, and that can actually make your feet really cold. And one thing that I've experienced before, especially as a kid, was adding a second pair of socks to keep my feet warmer and then pushing my foot into my boot. And what that did was actually just cut off all the blood flow to my feet and would actually make them cold. So I could never understand why my feet were super cold, even though I had an extra pair of socks on. Later, I learned it was all about circulation, and your feet actually do create a decent amount of heat, and they're actually always sweating. So if you wear one pair of socks with a well-fitting boot, it's likely to be warmer than having multiple pairs of socks with a very tight boot. So just keep that in mind, and also keep that in mind if you're trying on an insulated boot, you might have to go a half size up to account for that insulation inside of the boot. All right, let's take a moment to talk about weight. Why is the weight of your boot important? Well, the heavier the boot, the faster you are going to feel fatigued. The weight on your feet is often equated to the weight in your backpack by saying that 1 pound on your foot equals 5 pounds in your backpack. And I've even heard people say 8 or 10 pounds in your backpack. And what this means is that the energy it takes to move around the weight on your foot, 1 pound on your foot, is equal to the energy it takes to move around 5 pounds in your backpack. So that's pretty significant, right? Think about having boots that are 2 pounds each. I mean, those would be some heavy boots, but there's boots out there that approach that weight. Well, 2 pounds for each boot, that's like 10 pounds for each boot and 20 pounds altogether. I think most of us can agree that putting 20 pounds in your backpack would be a lot of weight. And what if it's actually even more like 8 or 10 pounds? You get the idea. So saving weight on your feet can actually make a big difference when it comes to the success of your hunt, because you will just feel less tired with less weight on your feet. Lots of different things contribute to the weight of the boot. If you have a leather boot, it's likely to be heavier. If there's some sort of shank in the boot, often there can be a steel shank in your boot to keep it stiff. Often a big, chunky, stiff sole is going to be heavier. The taller the boot, the heavier it's going to be. Often the more durable the boot is, the heavier it's going to be. So there's all these different characteristics that add up to make a heavy boot. And if you want a lightweight boot, you are going to give up some of the advantages that a tall boot or a very durable boot or a stiff boot might give you. So it's always a trade-off. Most people prefer the feel of a lighter boot, but there may be times when you need the functionality of something heavier. One more feature to look for on a hunting boot before we talk about fit is a rubber rand. A rand is this piece of rubber that runs around the circumference of the boot. If you took it off the boot, it would be like an 1.5 inch thick ribbon of rubber. And then they wrap it around the boot, and it helps to protect the stitching. It helps to protect from abrasion, and it also helps you keep the shape of the boot, and so that you don't create a hole in high wear areas where the boot is flexing or your foot is rubbing. So it does add a little bit of weight, but it will also make your boot significantly more durable. Okay, so we've gone through all of these different characteristics, but I've saved the best for last because I want to talk about fit. You could have your perfect boot. Let's say you're looking for a medium stability, sort of medium flex boot. It's 8 inches tall, so you can walk through some water. It's leather because you want the durability of leather. I'm just making things up, but say you've found your perfect boot and then you put it on and you realize that it doesn't fit your foot. It's too narrow for your foot, or it just feels like there's not enough volume in there for your foot to fit, or the heel cup doesn't feel like it secures your heel when you're walking around and you're getting a lot of heel slip. Well, if your boot doesn't fit and doesn't feel comfortable to you, it's not going to work. There's just really no way to get around it. And so I think fit is king when it comes to hunting boots. You could get away with something that's not ideal in some other aspects, but if it fits you well and you're comfortable in it, you're going to do so much better on your hunt than if you're wearing something that's giving you blisters or crushing your feet or giving you knee pain or something else because it doesn't fit right. So it can be tricky to find a boot that fits right, and really the only way you can do this is to go and try on different boots. And there are some things to keep in mind when you're trying on a boot. One is that it will loosen up a little bit, especially if it is a leather material. It most likely will break in a little bit, but if it's not comfortable when you put it on, I would go look for something else. There's just so many boots out there that you really don't have to settle for something less than ideal when it comes to fit. There's likely a brand that makes something for your narrow foot or for your wide foot or for your high arch. There's likely something that you can find that is going to feel good to you and then feel even better, hopefully, when you break it in. Another thing that you should know when you're trying on boots is how long you want the boot to be. You definitely don't want it to be cramping your toes, because then if you think about walking downhill, you're likely to be slamming your toes into the front of the boot. A good rule of thumb is to be able to stick one finger behind your heel down into the boot. And if there's some room for one finger, you probably have enough room in there. You don't want tons of room back there, because you don't want a sloppy boot where your foot's going to move a lot forward and back and give you blisters. But you do want a little bit of room in that toe so that if your feet swell or if you're going downhill, you're not going to just be jamming your toes. Now, again, if you put on boots and you have that one finger behind your heel and the length seems good, but it's just not comfortable, try something else. It's not worth it to spend the money on boots and not be comfortable in them. So that's all I can really say about fit. Everybody's foot is going to be different. So just find something that works for you. You can always try different lacing methods if you find something that's nearly there, but some part of it isn't quite right. Try lacing the boot tighter or looser, or changing the way that the laces are put through the eye holes, and find something that works for you and that feels comfortable for you. And don't just take someone's word for it that it's a comfy or good boot. If it doesn't feel right on your foot, you need to try something else. All right, guys. Well, I hope this has been helpful for you just thinking through all the different characteristics of a hunting boot. And likely you've been listening along and kind of building out what type of boot you would want in your head. Maybe you're thinking, oh, synthetic really makes sense to me. I want a shorter boot that is nice and light and will be breathable in the early season. Or maybe you're thinking, man, I hunt in a very cold place. I need something that is nice and insulated. Whatever it is, now you can kind of evaluate a boot and see if it's going to fit for your purposes and the types of hunts that you will be on. Now, as promised, I want to tell you a little bit about my experience with hunting boots recently. And I just want to give you a little context so you understand what we're working with before we get into sort of what I've been experiencing with my boots. So my foot is very flat. It's pretty wide. If I get out of a pool and walk around on the pool deck, it's like you're following a duck around. Those are the footprints that I leave. And I usually end up wearing longer shoes because my foot is wide and I want that extra width, or a wide version of a shoe. I usually wear like a 10.5 or 10.5 wide. Now, my foot is also very low volume, so sometimes those wider shoes are made essentially for a fatter foot, and my foot has very low volume, so sometimes those wide shoes don't work as well, and I have a regular or even narrow heel. I also have an accessory bone, an accessory navicular. So it's an extra navicular bone in my foot. It's on the inside of my foot. And sometimes that rubs and gets irritated. It's kind of there for no reason and it's annoying, but I've got it and that's what I'm dealing with. I used to run a lot. I ran cross country in high school and I still run a little bit here and there. So I think my feet are pretty strong, I would say. And growing up backpacking, I always trended towards more minimal footwear for backpacking. I would go backpacking in running shoes, and that just felt better than wearing big hiking boots when weather permitted. So generally, I prefer mid, sort of neutral to minimal shoes. I prefer flatter shoes. I kind of am into the idea that your foot is built to function in a certain way and that the muscles in your foot, the arch in your foot, all of that actually needs to be used in order to function. And that might sound a little ironic coming from a person with flat feet. I used to think that was a problem until I found out Usain Bolt has flat feet. So I kind of had to get over it at that point, right? But generally speaking, I think some of the things that we do with our feet and with our boots can mess up the way that our body moves in our natural biomechanics. So that's sort of my perspective on all of this. Now, when it comes to hunting boots, I've been trending a little bit away from that because I've been thinking a lot about carrying heavy loads. And almost all the advice I see online and from other people is to get a stiffer, heavier boot to support your ankle and to help when you have a heavy backpack on. And to me, that makes some sense. Maybe your foot is designed to work really well barefoot when you have only your body weight. But what about when you add 100 pounds to your back? Then maybe it would be a good idea to have some support around the ankle or have some stiffness in the sole of the boot so that you can deal with those heavier packs and be more stable. So I've been trending with boots a little bit away from my sort of minimalist mindset. And I started with a pair of Loa Renegade boots that I was wearing a couple of years ago. They're leather. I do like leather because it's natural and because it's more durable. So I was wearing these Loa Renegade boots for a while. They're Gore-Tex lined, but they really are just an overbuilt running shoe in some ways. They're not nearly as stiff as some of these other hunting boots that are out on the market. So I was actually really comfortable in my Loa Renegades, but I realized two things. One, I was interested in something taller so that I could feel more comfortable when walking through water and just more confident that I wasn't going to get my feet wet. And also, I was thinking about getting something more durable because the Loa Renegades are constructed with multiple pieces of leather stitched together, and the boots were starting to bust at the seams near the ball of my foot. So I was looking for something that was taller and something that was more durable. So as I was looking around at all my options, I came across Crispy boots. They're a brand that makes some really great hunting boots. And I was also looking at some Schnee's boots. I tried on the Schnee's and they were just way too narrow for my foot. So I tried on the Crispies instead. And the Crispy Nevadas felt amazing when I tried them on in the store. They're 8 inches tall. They're leather. They are very durable. They have a nice rubber rand. People rave about them. And so I figured when I put them on and they felt comfortable, I was like, this is it. This is what I'm going for. And I bought a pair on sale. In some ways, the Crispies have been amazing, and specifically the Crispy Nevadas. I want to talk about the Nevadas specifically because Crispy makes all types of different boots for different applications. So my feedback here is only applicable to the Nevadas. The great things about them are that they are incredibly waterproof. I was hunting last season with buddies who were changing to different pairs of boots on different days because their feet were getting wet, but I was able to wear my waterproof boots for days on end, and my feet really were dry and pretty warm. They're also a little bit taller, like I talked about. They are resolable, which I really appreciate because once I wear the sole out, I can just go get a new sole for maybe a third of the price of what the boots cost me up front. And they seem to do everything they promise in that they do keep your ankle pretty secure. They do seem very sturdy and solid. It's like every step feels kind of stable and the same because of the way the footbed and the sole is made. And they keep my feet dry, which is amazing. So there's lots of things I love about them, and they really are a piece of quality craftsmanship. However, I've been having some problems with them. First of all, they're heavy. They're about 1 pound, 13 ounces for each boot. And that's significantly heavier than the boots that I used to be in, those Loa Renegades. And I have been feeling it. The other day I was bear hunting and I was doing about 4 miles with 3,500 feet of elevation and a backpack and a rifle. And I was regretting wearing these heavy boots. I wished I had worn my old busted up boots instead. The heavy, stiff Nevadas have also kind of messed up my gait. And I've noticed that, especially going downhill, it really hurts my knees because the way the boot holds my foot going downhill, it really encourages me to slam my heel into the ground. And with a stiff boot that's kind of holding my ankle and my foot all in place, it makes it so a lot of pressure and a lot of force is going through my knees. And if you walk downhill without shoes on or with flexible shoes on, you'll notice that when you put the ball of your foot downhill, you kind of flex it out to match the slope of the hill. And with the Nevadas, I've been having a hard time doing that. I actually have to loosen the boot to be able to then flex my foot appropriately to go downhill and not hurt my knees. And then you actually kind of lose the ankle support that's advertised because your boot is looser and you're trying to flex your foot. I've found these boots to be very uncomfortable on flat ground, and there's really not much ground feel, and I find that it's hard to walk on hard objects. So like we were talking about, logs or rocks, it's actually less stable than a boot that would have a more flexible sole. And then on top of it all, these were very expensive boots. So as much as I like them and as much as I recognize the quality of the boots and that they are going to last for a long time, I'm sort of wondering if I drank the marketing Kool-Aid and got into a boot that isn't right for me. And I've even been considering selling it and going back to something that's more minimal and more flexible. And even if it's not as durable, I think having a less durable boot might be preferable if it means my knees won't hurt and I'll be more comfortable hiking around in the backcountry. So you might ask, well, what about having a stiff, supportive boot for carrying heavy loads? And my answer is, I'm not sure that having a stiff boot is actually the best solution, because when you have a stiff, supportive boot and your foot is locked into that L shape, it actually makes it so that your foot can't adapt to different surfaces that well. And so when I'm walking with that stiff boot, if I step on an unstable surface, say I step on a rock and my foot turns to one side, it actually torques my whole lower leg and the force goes through my knee, which is, to me, not preferable. I would rather my foot be able to move naturally and be able to adapt to a surface so that then I can prevent all that force coming up through the rest of my leg. I think to solve the problem and prevent myself from getting injured when I'm carrying a heavy load, I'm going to focus on working up to heavy loads slowly, strengthening my lower legs and my ankles, and kind of coming at it from a more natural perspective instead of just trying to shove my foot into a cast, essentially. So that's my plan. That's sort of my trajectory. Now, again, like I talked about towards the beginning of this episode, different people have different needs and different feet, and different things feel comfortable to different people. So there's lots of people out there who enjoy the crispy Nevadas and they seem to work great for them. And I don't think they're lying. So once again, everybody's feet are different. What's going to feel comfortable and work for you might not work for another person. And at the end of the day, you've got to find a boot that works for you. All right, guys, that's all for today. I hope this has been helpful for you. Go find a good pair of boots, and I will catch you next week.